Hey, everybody. Welcome to another episode of The Bitter Pill. So, tonight I want to talk about an aspect of the pro Israel narrative that I find very annoying, and it's also related to other aspects of how pro Israel folks look at the conflict. And in particular, you often hear from Zionists, from pro Israel folks, that Hamas started it on October 7th. And if Hamas hadn't started this conflict that's going on now, then uh, we would be at peace, etc. And a number of things are related to this perspective that involve, basically ignoring both the historical context, because of course history didn't start on October 7th, and more or less ignoring or dehumanizing, basically invisibilizing the Palestinian people. So I wrote about this in some detail in a piece that I've published a draft of on my Substack blog, which, if you don't know, is jeffmelton.substack.com. And also, just as you can see there, I'd kind of like it if you guys could like and share this video, subscribe to the channel, and help us grow and boost me in the algorithm. And also check out the blog. So, another thing I wanted to do tonight is advertise for my live stream that I'm doing tomorrow night at 8 p.m. because I've been having a little bit of difficulty. I'm not sure what it is about YouTube's algorithm that makes it harder to get a lot of views on live streams, generally speaking, even after the recording is up and people can go watch it later, than is typically the case, at least in my experience, for videos that I've recorded. So, for instance, I think the most views I've gotten on a live stream is like 250 or 300, something around there. And I have a bit over 300 subscribers. So not even as many views as I have subscribers. Whereas, granted, most of the videos that I record also don't garner a large audience. I've had some recorded videos get in the thousands of views. So there's something going on where if I record something, more people tend to watch it than is the case if I go live. And maybe people aren't getting notified about the live streams. But in any case, I wanted to go ahead and let you know about tomorrow's live stream, where I'm going to be talking, first of all, about this myth that Hamas uses human shields, and Israel sort of uses that as an excuse to justify bombing of civilians. And the second thing I wanted to talk about tomorrow night is, let's see, what was I going to talk about? Let me just show you the video description. Part 1, the Israeli government and its supporters frequently claim that Hamas uses civilians as human shields. Not only is there no evidence that this claim is true, but evidence indicates that actually Israeli troops have frequently done this very thing, using human shields. So, sorry, I meant to show you this. Okay, there we go. Yeah. So there's Israeli troops actually using a Palestinian as a human shield in the West Bank in a conflict that took place there, I believe, last year. So as I was saying, evidence indicates that Israeli troops have frequently used human shields, and so far, at least, there's no evidence that Hamas has done so. But I'll talk about that in more detail tomorrow night. And the second thing I want to talk about tomorrow night is that we have Elon Musk now claiming that certain words and slogans used by pro Palestinian activists constitute an implicit call for genocide. And he suggested in one of his tweets about that X, formerly known as Twitter, is going to begin censoring people for using these phrases or words, namely um, colonization, I believe it was, and from the river to the sea, which is a slogan that really you'll hear at. I've been going to protest in favor of Palestinians' rights since the 1980s, and I've heard that slogan since back then, and it's never meant what Elon Musk and other supporters of Israel are attributing to it. So anyway, that's tomorrow night at 8 p.m. Or maybe you're watching this Sunday. Probably you are if you're watching it. So that would be tonight, Sunday the 19th at 8 p.m. Or maybe you're watching it later and this announcement is irrelevant. But anyway, let's get into tonight's topic. So, so the title of my blog post, which I'm going to be getting a slightly revised version of it published on Savage Minds, another Substack blog that has a much larger audience than my blog. But the title is Did Nat Turner Start It? Which is sort of a facetious reference to what a lot of supporters of Israel, a lot of Zionists have said. I've seen this over and over and over again on Twitter in the past month or so, that Hamas started it. Even a story about a Palestinian father and his infant who were massacred by Israeli bombs. Drew the response, Hamas started it. You voted for them, meaning Gazans. You brought this on yourselves. Well, obviously, most most people in Gaza did not vote for Hamas in that election. First of all, it was an election in which the winner, Hamas, got a plurality of the vote, something like 45%. Presumably, not everybody voted. Most people who are alive now either were kids or were not even born at the time of this election, which I believe was in 2007 or 6. But anyway, just ridiculous to say is somehow civilians in Gaza's fault that Hamas launched the October 7th raid on the Israeli side of the border. And we'll get into the details of that later. But anyway, so there were countless comments to that same effect, as if there was nothing going on between Israelis and Palestinians before October 7th. Israelis had nothing but love for their Palestinian brethren and vice versa before Hamas decided to ruin the love fest on October 7th. Okay, I'm not gonna just read this to you because I know that would be boring. So I'm gonna just try to have a conversation with you about the content of this article. But in any case, it's not as though this idea that Hamas started it came out of nowhere. It's something that was shaped by how the Israeli government itself, Western political leaders, and the corporate media have presented it, where suddenly, starting on October 7th, that's all they talked about was that Hamas crossed the border, crossed the fence between Gaza and Israel on the morning of October 7th and launched an attack against the Israeli military. Many civilians were killed in the process. And the way it was framed was this was just a terrorist attack as opposed to an attempt to accomplish several military purposes that I'll get into later. But in any case, let's look at what some powerful people in the West, including Israel, said about October 7th. So, according to the Israeli Defense Forces, the IDF, this is a war started by Hamas. Our soldiers are ready to do more than respond. Hamas terrorism must cease to exist. U.S. House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries characterized the Hamas led military action as a violent, unprovoked, and despicable terrorist attack against the state of Israel. So, unprovoked kind of goes hand in hand with the notion that Hamas started it, and we'll critically examine that later. On October 7th, the day that this escalation of the conflict started, President Joe Biden stated, "Today, the people of Israel are under attack orchestrated by a terrorist organization, Hamas." Another aspect of the framing, that's all Hamas is a terrorist organization, according to the way they're represented by Western politicians and media. Is that really, all there is to Hamas? Is Hamas all there is in Gaza? Well, we'll talk about it. So, Labour Party leader Keir Starmer in the UK said there was no justification for the Hamas led acts of terror. And he uttered the tired old cliche that Israel has a right to defend itself. You hear that phrase all the time. Israel has the right to defend itself. Israel being the colonizer of Palestinian land since 1948 when it was founded. So you can look at this as an instance of what we psychologists call DARVO, uh, deny, attack, reverse victim, and offender. DARVO is a tactical maneuver that manipulators use to groom individuals and indeed entire social groups, such as um, Palestinians and their supporters. It involves controlling people's perceptions of events through a specific sequence of actions. So basically, you know, a fictional narrative is crafted that reverses victim and offender. So Israel is the one under attack and has the right, so to speak, to defend itself, even though, in fact, Israel has ethnically cleansed Palestinian lands since its founding in 1948 in a very violent manner. And people who are under colonial occupation have the right under international law to defend themselves. In fact, occupiers do not. So, anyway, I don't know if you've heard that term, Darvo, but I like it because you see it a lot in the way that bullies try to sort of distort reality to justify their oppression of others. You see it all the time in violent domestic relationships and domestic cases of domestic violence. The abuser does this somehow. They're the one under attack. And you see this in these military conflicts involving colonization as well. Another politician who had something dumb to say about this, who I talked about last week, is Bernie Sanders, Senator Bernie Sanders, who frequently justifies Israel's violence. He back in 2014, when Israel did more or less the same thing that they're doing now on a smaller scale, that is, bombed Gaza to smithereens, killing a couple of thousand people at that time. Bernie basically claimed that it was somehow Hamas's fault for firing rockets into Israel. But anyway, Bernie said of the October 7th military operation that there's no justification for this violence. So, long story short, the standard view in Western imperialist centers of power is that the October 7th operation was an unprovoked bolt from the blue directed against poor innocent Israel by a bunch of crazy terrorists. It was as though there was mass collective amnesia among the Western political elite regarding Israel's 75-year history of brutality toward the Palestinians. But that's nothing new, because this pattern, this perspective, where members of oppressed groups who engage in armed resistance, are portrayed as aggressors whose attacks were unprovoked, and in general sort of strips oppressed groups of their humanity, really has a long history. So take, for example, the case of the US war in Vietnam. So Vietnam supposedly started the Vietnam War by twice attacking a US destroyer, the USS Maddox, that for some reason was within Vietnamese territorial waters, just off Vietnam's coast, violating Vietnam's uh, territory. As it turns out, according to declassified US government documents, at least one of these so called attacks didn't even occur. But in any case, even if one of them did, uh, it's ridiculous to say it was unprovoked, and it's even more ridiculous to say that Vietnam started the war. So, anyway, based on this alleged attack, uh, the Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin resolution with only two Congress people voting against it, and that marked the beginning of major U.S. involvement in Vietnam. But this notion that Vietnam, quote unquote, started the war not only is incorrect, because what on earth was the warship doing in Vietnamese territorial waters, but it also ignores the fact that Vietnam had been subjected to decades of brutal French colonial occupation and war, followed by the US installing a brutal dictator, Ngo Dinh Diem, not sure how you pronounce his name, that was basically he was basically a puppet of the United States, and so he was the ruler of what at the time was called South Vietnam. They had kind of divided the country in half based on the fact that the National Liberation Front, or no, I'm sorry, that's the name of the South Vietnamese rebels. The North Vietnamese army was successful in seizing control of the northern half of the country and formed a government there, a communist led by Ho Chi Minh. And the South was controlled first by the French and then by the US and their puppets, such as Mr. Diem. So, in reality, the Vietnam War, or Second Indochina War as it's sometimes called, began in 1954, several years before the Gulf of Tonkin incident, between the Diem government and the National Liberation Front, which was the South Vietnamese guerrilla group formed to resist this government that was a pawn of Western imperialism. And we all are familiar with the claim that Russia, quote unquote, started the Ukraine war when it invaded Ukraine in February 2022. In fact, most people accept that. But the reality is that there had been a civil war going on in Ukraine since 2014, when the US in early 2014 had backed a coup that resulted in fascistic forces, including literal Nazis like the Azov Battalion, becoming a dominant military and political force in Ukraine. And one of the results of the coup was relentless persecution of ethnic Russians and violence towards them. They comprise the majority of residents of eastern Ukraine, but an oppressed minority, particularly after the far right seized power within Ukraine as a whole. So, residents of the province of Crimea in southeastern Ukraine voted overwhelmingly to secede from Ukraine in 2014 and become part of Russia. And meanwhile, residents of the provinces of Donetsk, immediately to the north, and Luhansk in the northeast corner of Ukraine, declared themselves to be or declared Donetsk and Luhansk to be independent republics. And so the coup government there in Kiev, where the president at the time was Poroshenko, Zelensky came along in 2019. The government began waging war on Donetsk and Luhansk, resulting in 14,000 deaths between 2014 and 2022. You don't really hear about that much, but it's been a horrible situation there. Not quite as horrible as what's going on in Gaza now, certainly, but quite bad for almost 10 years now. And Russia only entered the conflict after the Donetsk and Luhansk governments asked for Russia's help in fending off an expected ground invasion by Ukrainian troops. There was a big increase in shelling in the months preceding the launching of the Russian special military operation on February 24th, 2022. And there was a huge gathering of something like 100,000 Ukrainian troops right on the border with Donetsk and Luhansk, and intelligence interceptions apparently revealed that they were about to invade. And so Donetsk and Luhansk asked for Russia's help. And also, there were various Ukrainian provocations of Russia leading up to that, including threats to invade Crimea, threats to join NATO, threats to acquire nuclear weapons. So, as in the case of the Vietnam War, when you look closely at the notion that the Ukraine war began with an unprovoked attack by Russia on Ukraine, uh, that notion kind of falls apart. And in fact, when you look at most armed conflicts, central fact about them is that they involve oppressors and oppressed groups. And harking back to the title of this article, did Nat Turner start it? Maybe I forgot to mention who Nat Turner was at the beginning. He was a slave in the United States, and he led a rebellion against slavery in 1831. So the title references what I hope you all will recognize as an absurd claim, the notion that slave rebellions, such as Turner's in 1831, started the violent conflict between slave owners and slavery abolitionists that culminated in the Civil War. And a brief summary of the details about this rebellion: Turner and about 70 fellow slaves attacked many plantations in Virginia, freeing the slaves and also killing about 60 plantation residents, which included not only slave owners, but also many of their wives and children and whatever other white people they could find. They even decapitated children, which is something that Hamas was falsely accused of. You remember the story of the 40 beheaded babies in the aftermath of the October 7th operation, military operation, that actually turned out not to be true. And in fact, only one baby, according to the Israeli government's own casualty figures, died on October 7th. And we don't know who killed that baby. But in any case, going back to Nat Turner, the response to the rebellion and the massacres was really reminiscent of what we've seen over the past few weeks from Israel, just grossly out of proportion to the original event. So, it's currently estimated that something like 1,200 Israelis, several hundred of them military people, were killed on October 7th. Some of them killed by Israel. We don't know how many. I'll get into that later. But the response has been over 10,000. I think it's over 11,000, maybe 12,000 Palestinians in Gaza having been killed over the past few weeks. Over 150 in the West Bank, where Hamas doesn't even exist. So in Turner's case, he and his collaborators were caught and they were executed. But in addition to that, that's kind of expected. But in addition to that, a couple hundred slaves who had not participated in the rebellion were also killed, as well as many free black people being killed by angry white mobs. So you can imagine if they were questioned about what they did, members of these lynched mobs saying, in their defense, but Nat Turner started it. Now, of course, if they hadn't been enslaved, Nat Turner and his fellow slaves would presumably never have murdered any white people. I guess it happens sometimes, but probably not. In reality, who started it, of course, was the Europeans who colonized North America and kidnapped Africans and enslaved them and brought them back here. And in comparison to the violence of slavery, the violence meted out by Turner and his fellow slaves is just a tiny drop in the bucket. And sure, you can say, and I would agree, that they shouldn't have killed innocent people, women, and certainly not children. But that violence, however unjustified you might think some of it is, or I might think some of it is, it pales in comparison, right, to slavery. We can look in similar fashion at another central dimension of the founding and early history of the United States, as well as Canada, and that's the genocide carried out against Native Americans. And there was a lot of bloody conflict between Native Americans of various tribes and European settlers, including some quote unquote unprovoked attacks by Native Americans. In the so called Jamestown Massacre of 1622, nearly 350 men, women, and children were killed by members of the Powhatan tribe. But, of course, I'm sure you know, a hell of a lot more than 350 people were killed in the genocide perpetrated against Native Americans by the colonists and later by U.S. troops. You see pretty much the same pattern in other cases of resistance against colonization. That is, resistance against colonization is violent. In South Africa, the African National Congress was known for its nonviolent resistance to apartheid, but it also had an armed wing, Umkhonto weSizwe, I think is how you say it, whose activities included many bombings, mostly of government buildings or military installations, but also bombings of banks, restaurants, bars, and supermarkets in whites-only neighborhoods. Same story in India. Of course, India is well known as with South Africa, for nonviolent resistance against colonial occupation, led in India's case by Gandhi. But as in the South African case, in India there was considerable armed resistance to the British colonial occupation that in some cases included killings of civilians. And likewise in Algeria, the Front de Libération Nationale, the FLN, mounted armed resistance to French colonial occupation that included assassinations of French administrators and those Algerian citizens deemed to be collaborators with the colonial regime. And of course, such groups were often characterized as terrorists by the colonial occupiers. I think the British coined the term terrorist and applied it to those resisting them in India. Even though, of course, colonization is an inherently violent and indeed terroristic act. Now, hopefully, most of you don't think that Nat Turner or Native American armed resistance to European colonizers of North America or the other groups that I mentioned were nothing more than terrorists. Nor, I hope, do you think that they are the ones who started armed conflicts with their oppressors. Because who started it is not only almost certainly those whose goal was to dispossess people of their land, their resources, or in the case of slaves, their freedom altogether, but it's also irrelevant who started it, given the nature of the oppressor's goals. It's certainly reasonable to condemn violence against innocent people. So, for example, young children of European colonizers or slave owners aren't responsible for the sins of their elders who colonized or enslaved. But if one fails to place that condemnation in the context of the incomparably greater violence of the colonists or slave owners against the colonized or enslaved, we're bearing in mind the reason why these rebellions that are very violent are occurring in the first place. That is, they wouldn't be happening without the colonization or the slavery. You're missing the forest for the trees. And that also applies to the conflict that's been in the headlines for the past 6 weeks or so between Israelis and Palestinians. Of course, it's been going on for many, many decades before now. But lately, the tendency has just been to talk about the past 6 weeks, the period since October 7th. So even though the Israeli government and its Zionist allies pretend otherwise, certainly the conflict didn't start on October 7th. You could say that the conflict between Israel and Palestinians, in fact, started in 1948 when Israel was founded. But even decades before Israel's founding, Jewish settlers from Europe and other places, often far away from Palestine, were moving to Palestine and violently evicting its native inhabitants from their land. And they were quite explicit about wanting to ethnically cleanse the land of Palestinians, who from the beginning were dehumanized and invisibilized. So let me just play a little clip about that from Abby Martin's video on how Palestine became colonized.
Yet Zionists' aim for a homeland in all of Greater Israel, without the indigenous Arabs, was still driving them. In 1919, a U.S. envoy reported, the Zionists looked forward to a practically complete dispossession of the present non-Jewish inhabitants of Palestine. Settlers had now become 10% of the population, growing with large donations from Western tycoons. The settlements had already created a refugee crisis. This photo from 1929 depicts a rally in Syria of Palestinian refugees, of which there were 50,000. With this new backing, the colonial project picked up its pace, purchasing even larger chunks of earth from the feudal landlords and creating small pockets of territory. leader in the settlement movement, Ben-Gurion, who would become Israel's first prime minister and mascot for Tel Aviv's airport, wrote about the early days. We were not just working. We were conquering land. We were a company of conquistadors. From 1920 to 1939, the settler population rose from 10 to 30%.
Okay, so and they didn't make any bones about what they were up to. And in fact, the slogan "a land without a people for a people without a land" became very popular among Zionists, those who believed that Israel, or Palestine actually, is a place that that Jews from all over the world are entitled to develop into a Jewish state. But this slogan, "a land without a people for a people without a land," implies that Palestinians as a people don't exist. Former Israeli Prime Minister Golda Meir infamously declared in an interview in 1969, that there was no such thing as Palestinians. It was not as though there was a Palestinian people in Palestine considering itself as a Palestinian people, and we came and threw them out and took their country away from them, which that's exactly what happened. They did not exist. Never mind that despite not formally having a country, Palestinians had a vibrant and unique culture and identified as Palestinians. They had a national identity as Palestinians for quite some time, even before Zionist settlers began arriving in the early 1900s. And never mind that Palestine was their home. As far as the proponents of the Zionist colonial project were concerned, and the same exact thing is true today, Palestinians, if they were thought of as human beings at all, were just Arabs who could live in any Arab nation, which, of course, is a convenient rationalization for making them move to some other Arab country and just ignore the fact that Palestine was their home. Because after all, they claimed, the Arabs, quote unquote, were only getting in the way of the colonizers' efforts to, quote unquote, make the desert bloom. As David Ben Gurion put it, we must expel the Arabs and take their places. So, as settlers are coming in, they're engaging in the process of getting the Palestinians out of the way by any means necessary, just as Ben Gurion advocated, or Ben Gurion, I'm not sure how you say it. And that was very violent. There were brutal attacks on Palestinian villages, killing many people. And at the time, the British were aiding in this colonization process. The British sent troops there. And so the settlers steadily took over Palestinian land. And then in 1947, the UN decided to grant Israel a state right on top of Palestinian land. Nobody asked the Palestinians. And so in 1948, Israel comes into being, granted statehood based on a United Nations partition plan that called for 55% of Palestinian land to be granted to this new state of Israel, even though Palestinians were more than 2/3 of the population at the time. But that wasn't enough for the more fanatical far right elements of the Zionist movement, such as a fascist Irgun militia and its political wing, the Freedom Party, which was the predecessor of a party that you may recognize today, the ruling Likud party of Benjamin Netanyahu. Albert Einstein, perhaps the most famous Jew of the mid 20th century, characterized the Freedom Party as a political party closely akin in its organization methods, political philosophy, and social appeal to the Nazi and fascist parties. What is now referred to by Palestinians as the Nakba, or catastrophe, started shortly after the founding of Israel in 1948. It was an all-out military offensive aimed at ethnically cleansing the new Israeli state of as many Palestinians as possible. So there were wholesale massacres of the inhabitants of just scores and scores of villages. Ultimately, more than 500 Palestinian villages were just completely wiped out. The inhabitants either fled or were killed. Approximately 15,000 Palestinians were killed during the Nakba, which lasted a bit over a year. And more than 750,000 Palestinians, which at that time was the vast majority of the Palestinian population, were forced to flee for their lives. So some of them wound up in Gaza, and their descendants have been there ever since. Many of them fled the region entirely, and in any case, many of them were forced out of their original villages and wound up in refugee camps, etc. So Israel went from having control of 55% of the land to having control of 78% of Palestine after this conflict. And I'm not going to, of course, take the time to go through the entire history of Israel since then, but just to make a long story short, at varying paces from year to year, the same pattern of violence and ethnic cleansing has been ongoing for 75 years now, including during the years leading up to what happened on October 7th, which Hamas and the other organizers of it called Operation Al Aqsa Flood. Well, why did they choose that name? Al Aqsa is a mosque in Jerusalem. That's the third holiest site.
Yes, there is a mosque in Jerusalem.
Alexa, quiet. Sorry. I didn't even say her name. Anyway, so Al Aqsa Mosque is the third holiest site in the Muslim religion. And there were many violent attacks on worshippers at this mosque by the police, the IDF, Jewish settlers over the past few years, including within the few weeks leading up to October 7th. And there were lots of other provocations. Thousands of Palestinians were being held as political prisoners in Israeli jails, either hostages. And that sort of makes recent one sided calls to release the hostages uttered by supporters of Israel, and they only mean Israeli hostages. And that's a particularly cruel example of Palestinians being rendered sort of invisible. They don't talk about the fact that Israel is holding Palestinians by the thousands in prison, often without any charge or with very minimal or ridiculous, frivolous charges. The pace of illegal settlements in the West Bank, the other major part of the little bit of territory that Palestinians still have in Palestine, that's picked up over the past few years. And what's been going on over the past month and a half, of course, is far from the first time that Gaza has been mercilessly bombed. As I mentioned, one instance was in 2014 when a couple thousand people were killed. There was also bombing in 2021, 2008, and 2009. And since Hamas was elected in, I believe, in 2006, Gaza has been under a state of siege. Israel has exerted complete control over what comes into Gaza, including food. They've, quote unquote, put Gaza residents on a diet, meaning they only let enough food in to basically just keep them alive. And yeah, they blockaded supplies of lots of other things, impoverishing Gazans, rendering it very difficult for them to get clean water. They only have electricity for 4 hours a day, typically, and so forth. That's been going on for 17 years. So, in other words, life under Israeli apartheid is altogether a provocation. And as I was mentioning, people under military occupation have the right under international law to resist that occupation through whatever means are at their disposal, including armed struggle. And you might say, oh, well they haven't been occupying Gaza until very recently. They withdrew their troops and withdrew settlements in 2005 or 6, I can't remember. But they've encircled Gaza, controlled everything that goes in and out, won't let people out even if they have a medical emergency in a lot of cases. So they're trapped in this open air prison, 5 miles by 25 miles, 2.3 million people. And that's not materially or morally different from literal occupation, where troops are physically within the territory. And so people trapped in this open air prison or concentration camp, as people have also called it, have the right under international law to resist. And it's not like they haven't tried nonviolent resistance. They certainly have engaged in protests, most famously the Great March of Return in 2018, during which tens of thousands of unarmed Gaza residents approached the fence separating Gaza from Israel in protest of their imprisonment within Gaza and of the blockade. And right from the very beginning of this peaceful protest by unarmed civilians, Israeli snipers were shooting members of the crowd. So ultimately, over the course of those few months, they killed and they murdered more than 200 Palestinian protesters and wounded approximately 8,000 with their gunshots. And of course, there was a lot of hope that this protest, the Great March of Return in 2018, would evoke international sympathy for the protesters. But that never really materialized to any significant degree. So they're still stuck in their prison. And so at some point, Hamas and other armed groups in Gaza decided to organize a breakout from the prison, basically. And so that's what happened on October 7th. Took years of planning. So, given the failure of the Great March of Return, which was a very determined and persistent protest over many, many months, and the brutal response of the Israeli military, there's plenty of reason to believe that, just as we've seen with successful decolonization movements in the past, the only way that Palestinians are going to gain their freedom is through some form of armed resistance. That's what many Palestinians have concluded. Will you condemn Hamas? Is what supporters of the Palestinian cause are inevitably asked by those who support their oppressors. But why should Palestinians and their allies be compelled to condemn Hamas? Should American slaves have been expected to condemn Nat Turner? Should black South Africans have been expected to condemn Umkhonto Wesizwe? Should Algerians have been expected to condemn the FLN? Why? Sure, they could condemn them, but because they did kill some innocent people. But again, the violence is incomparably greater by the side that's oppressing them. So in the present case, yes, it's true, there's evidence that on October 7th and the ensuing couple of days, civilians were killed, in some cases deliberately by Hamas and other militants. But there's likewise evidence that Israeli civilians were killed by Israel itself, by the much more heavily armed Israeli military in fairly large numbers, because Israel engaged in airstrikes, tank shelling, helicopter gunship attacks, and so forth on places where its commanders knew that Palestinian fighters were hiding out, but also knew that Israeli civilians were in the houses, in kibbutzes, in settlements. And in addition, the commander of the Gaza division, Brigadier General Avi Rosenfeld, even ordered an airstrike on his own military base in Erez, the crossing between Gaza and Israel. He's in a bunker deep underground, so he's not worried about getting hit. But of course, you order an airstrike on your own military base, trying to regain control of it from Hamas, which had taken it over. You're going to kill large numbers of your own troops in the process. And that's exactly what happened. That's how quite a few of the hundreds of Israeli troops died. So, it could very well be, in short, that the majority of both civilians and military personnel from Israel who were killed during that assault in early October were the result of Israeli fire. We don't really know for sure who killed how many. But, when you look at the extent of destruction, all these cars, all these buildings, homes, burned up or just completely demolished. AK-47s don't do that. Tank shells do that. Hellfire missiles do that, etc. And of course, in the month plus after that, there have been indiscriminate attacks on men, women, and children in both Gaza and the West Bank, as well as the complete cutoff of food, water, medicine, electricity, fuel, undoubtedly causing many more Palestinians to die in Gaza. In fact, it was just reported that 39 babies in incubators in Al Shifa Hospital, due to the lack of electricity, their incubators wouldn't work. They had to be taken out. Some of them have died. Likely all of them are going to die. And similarly with other people who need very intensive and resource intensive medical care, which at this point hospitals in Gaza are unable to provide them with. But Hamas is who we're compelled to condemn. Must our solidarity for Palestinians in their struggle for freedom be contingent on their being perfect victims? Apparently so, from what I've seen from a lot of people I see commenting on this issue on social media. As Palestinian American academic and activist Hala Alyan put it recently in the New York Times, the task of the Palestinian is to be palatable or to be condemned. The task of the Palestinian, we've seen in the past 2 weeks, is to audition for empathy and compassion, to prove that we deserve it, to earn it. And this insistence that those of us who agitate for Palestinian liberation must condemn Hamas, full stop, or else our advocacy for their cause, or perhaps even their cause itself of liberating Palestine and having equal rights for all ethnicities and religions in Palestine, is illegitimate. Saying that we have to condemn Hamas or else the cause is not legitimate implicitly takes the side of the oppressor. This attack by Hamas was planned as an assault on military installations on the Israeli side of the boundary. The stated objectives were: 1, to seize control of military bases and checkpoints and inflict major damage on the Israeli military. Second, to capture and bring back to Gaza enough prisoners to have leverage for negotiating the release of thousands of Palestinian prisoners. The intention was to take soldiers captive, prisoners of war, and most of the hostages are military. They're prisoners of war and captured in the course of battle. Some of them are civilians. It's not clear how many civilians were captured by Hamas fighters and how many were captured by others. But in any case, that was their goal, was to be able to have some leverage for negotiating the release of thousands of Palestinian prisoners who shouldn't be in prison in Israeli prisons. The objectives that they set out were achieved beyond their wildest dreams. They haven't achieved the release of Palestinian prisoners yet, but they've got the leverage to eventually do so. And they also really shattered the myth of an Israeli vulnerability, the invincibility of the Israeli military, and inflicted major damage on them. And certainly it's unfortunate that civilians were killed in the process, as is often the case in armed uprisings against colonial occupations. But again, focusing on that alone misses the forest for the trees, because the struggle for Palestinian liberation is, in my mind, indubitably a just cause. And unfortunately, armed resistance is a necessary facet of that struggle, just like with Umkhonto Wesizwe, the FLN, the Sandinista Front in Nicaragua, and countless others in the past. Groups like Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad, thus, are legitimate actors in that struggle, and hopefully with their help, one day Palestine will be free. Okay, well, I hope you have enjoyed this, and I will hopefully see you tomorrow night at 8 p.m. or if you're watching this on Sunday, that would be tonight at 8 p.m. If you're watching it afterwards, hopefully you caught the live stream and you're just catching this now. But anyway, I will see you next time.